Hi, I'm Chris Casteel in the Washington Bureau of the Oklahoman. I have Senator Tom Coburn with me today, Republican from Muskogee. Senator, thanks so much for coming in.
Good to be with you, Chris.
You've already been busy today talking about your Medicare plan to the Hudson Institute, a think tank. It's a plan that would introduce more competition into health care for seniors, gradually raise the eligibility age, take several steps as far as how it's financed by the people who use it. You know, conventional wisdom would say that in an election year, nobody's going to even talk about trying to reform Medicare, but you made an interesting comment today. You said an election year is a good time to do it. Why is that?
Well, first of all, people are listening. Number two is to put your head in the sand and say you can't talk about Medicare when it is the #1 driver of our actual national security problems, which is our debt, and to not talk about ways that we can give quality health care to seniors and ensure that they have that without taking away the standard of living of our children and grandchildren. It's a no-brainer to me. I think we ought to have that conversation because as a grandparent and traveling through Oklahoma, seniors want health care, but they also want their kids to have a great opportunity.
Right.
And to ignore this big gaping hole in our federal budget and the fact that we're going to fix it. I mean, it's going to get fixed, and to deny it is being untruthful with the American people. Let's talk about it.
Nobody at the White House or on Capitol Hill really denies that something doesn't have to be done. But how long do you think Congress has to do something about it before we're in kind of a crisis mode with it?
Well, we're in a crisis now in terms of Medicare, in terms of the fraud that's associated with it, in terms of the overutilization with it, in terms of the funding short stream. The question is why should the 60,000 Americans that are out there today who make more than $1 million a year be subsidized by everybody else in terms of Medicare Part B and Part D? We shouldn't. Let's change it. Nobody's going to disagree that we should change it.
Right.
Why should we continue to have $100 billion a year in fraud in Medicare? Let's change it. That actually helps Medicare stay around longer. That $100 billion that's going out in fraud is being paid for by our grandkids. Is it right to give them that lineage to $100 billion that we could save that we're not, that they're going to have to pay back? I would think we want to talk about that.
You know, last month, this month, the U.S. Treasury reported that the deficit for February, just that 1 month, was close to $230 billion. That used to be a pretty large amount for an entire year, and that was a record for an entire, supposedly we're in the midst of a recovery. Why is spending still running so far ahead of revenue at this point?
Because the career politicians in Washington refuse to do anything about the waste, the fraud, the duplication, the inconsistencies, and the inefficiencies of the federal government. And I think substantively, they're all thinking about the next election and the people who benefit from that, the well-heeled, the well-connected, and the programs. The GAO just put out this second report that I forced them to put out. I think easily
on duplication
of government programs. There's easy. If Congress would just do the work, we could save $150 billion a year just through duplication. I put an amendment on the floor this last week. Got voted down. We got 52 votes.
Right, and needed 60.
Needed 60 to eliminate $10 billion a year in duplication. It would have paid for the highway bill.
Right.
It would have paid for every cost of the highway bill. The difference between what's gone into the trust fund and what we need to spend would have paid for it and didn't get a vote for it.
Right.
So, I mean, the problem is the members of Congress, and quite frankly, I'm pretty well known with my thoughts on that. I think you need people here who have never been in politics before.
And I assume this is what you're going to address somewhat in, you've got a book coming out next month called The Debt Bomb, and I assume that's going to address both the causes for it in the first place and why you can't fix it.
Well, it's a purview all the way across, and I think we can fix it, but the American people are going to have to demand that it be fixed.
The Senate, the U.S. Senate this week almost had days of voting on on moving forward the picks for judgeships, federal judgeships all around the country. Democrats say Republicans are blocking this, blocking a lot of President Obama's picks to federal judicial positions. This seems to be like one of those issues that only inside Washington would this seem like something worth fighting over for days and days. I mean, what is the problem there? And we've got two Oklahoma nominations before the committee that you sit on, the Senate Judiciary Committee. Do you think those get through by the end of the year?
The circuit court judges probably do. Let me go back and, and address it. That was a charade. We've put forward more Obama judges than we did Bush's whole 4 years, and we've done that in 3. The whole plan of the White House and the Democrats is to run against Congress, the do-nothing Congress. You know, it's like I said earlier, why haven't we addressed the fraud in Medicare? Because they don't want us to do anything that makes it look like we're doing something. That was a farce to set up something, to create an issue that's something other than what we should be working on. The question I would want Oklahomans to ask is, why aren't you working on the real problems of the country? Why aren't you working on the debt? Why aren't you working on reforming the tax code? Why aren't you working on pulling back regulations? Why aren't you working on fixing Medicare and Medicaid? Why aren't you doing the things that are obviously associated with this massive deficit that we have and this debt? You know, every individual in this country is on the hook for $50,000. Every young person in this country in 20 years will be responsible for $1 million of federal debt. Tell me what kind of future that is. So the question is why are we not addressing the real issues and playing that game? That's because it's all about the next election and trying to create a controversy where none exists. Yeah,
you addressed in a speech on the Senate floor the question of leadership, and I guess the question would be, you know, why can't the leaders move those judgeships? I mean, why can't you just have votes?
They can. They have. We've already approved 9 judges since we've come back. I mean. Of the 16 that they were talking about, 6 just came out of judiciary last week. So
it's just a scheduling matter.
It's a game, and the reason it didn't happen, I think part of it was because of the lecture I gave to both the leaders about leadership. And if you're a leader and you're at an impasse, that says you're a lousy leader. That means you're failing to compromise, both sides. And so both leaders were responsible for that. It got solved, but it got solved because they recognized, well, it was much ado about nothing, and we're ignoring the real problems of the country.
Right. Speaking of federal judges, the U.S. Supreme Court in a couple of weeks is going to hear arguments in the Health Care Act that was passed in 2010. What are your expectations and hopes for that Supreme Court decision? Obviously, a lot of the focus is on the individual mandate and whether that piece is struck down as being against the Commerce Clause. But what do you hope is the end result of the Supreme Court case over the health care law?
My hope would be that the Supreme Court re-exerts its authority in telling Congress when they violated the enumerated powers of the Constitution, specifically the Commerce Clause. If you look at why our nation's in trouble today, it's because the Supreme Court in the past has not put the yoke on Congress when they step across the bounds of what is the true intent and authority of the Congress, as we've taken away 10th Amendment rights from the states and imposed our will by using the Commerce Clause to say we're in control of this, you're not as an American citizen. So my whole goal is if they get rid of that,
the
individual mandate, we will start back down the road of starting to bring back the federal government, starting to limit its role in everybody's life. You know, Chris,
so you're hoping for kind of a broader
statement on the Commerce Clause. You bet, because this country will not survive if we continue to allow this unimpeded expansion of the Commerce Clause. And survival, I'm talking about real freedom to do and live your life the way you want to.
Right.
And the freedom for states to actually run their states. If they don't, there's no reason. There is no reason to have a state anymore if the Congress can run it all. And if they allow this to stand, there's not anything on the basis, if they allow this precedent to stand, there's not anything the federal government can't do that impacts you living in Oklahoma.
Now, the issue over the contraception is not part of this case. At least it's not one of the specific questions that the court has taken in this case. But do you expect, because of the suits that have been filed, that the court will eventually have to take up this?
Yeah, they're going to, and it's not about contraception. You know, it's interesting. That's what we hear in the media. It has nothing to do with contraception. It has everything to do with whether or not the federal government can tell a religious organization what they can and can't do with regard to what their faith is and how it impacts how they employ people. And it's not contraception, it's whether or not you can send them on a mission trip, or whether or not you can tell them you're going to live in a monastery. I mean, if we can say you can violate your faith in this area, and your religious liberties don't have any impact in this area, they don't have any impact in any area. This is a very dangerous attack on the First Amendment, and it doesn't have anything to do with contraceptives. Let me some facts. You can buy birth control pills for $9 a month. If you can't afford $9 a month, if you can go to any
generic?
That's a generic, but you can go to any health department in Oklahoma and get them for free. So it's a false issue, and that's true across the country. It's a manufactured issue and hoodwinking the American people. What this administration is doing is challenging the First Amendment in terms of the practice and free expression of religion, and whether or not you have to violate your conscience to do something the federal government says you need to do.
You endorsed Romney, Mitt Romney, just before Super Tuesday. Because of what you said were his superior leadership qualities in comparison to the other candidates. And where do you see this race going? I mean, do you ultimately see him winning this nomination?
I don't know. I think it's healthy for us to have it. Everybody's worried, oh, well, you won't ever get your... I think it's wonderful to have primaries. It's wonderful to hear everybody talk. It's wonderful to let everybody vote and let it go where it goes. I actually served with everybody there except Mitt Romney.
Right.
I know when they're pulling the big one over people's eyes. I know how conservative a conservative is. I know real conservatives and people who claim to be real conservatives. What our country lacks today is leadership, real leadership, principled leadership, and the only person that has demonstrated success in all aspects of their life in terms of leadership is Mitt Romney. I want to trust that experience to lead our country. We're getting ready to face. I don't know why anybody would want to be president starting in 2013. We're going to face the largest problems that our nation has ever faced. The only way we're going to solve those problems is strength through leadership and somebody who's going to pull this country together rather than divide it.
Let me ask you real quick about the Oklahoma, on the Democratic side of the Oklahoma primaries. The president only got 57% of the vote in rural areas, and over in your part of the state, he did very, very poorly. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the president does so poorly in his own party there?
Well, I think basically Oklahomans as a group are fairly conservative. They believe in being left alone. They believe in freedom. They believe in the Constitution. And you can see from this administration, they're far outside of the bounds of the Constitution in lots of things that they're doing in terms of the rule of law. I mean, there's a lot of people in Oklahoma afraid because they're not following the rule of law in a lot of instances. If it doesn't fit, they just ignore it. I think that it's not party, it's policy. And where there's no question we have a socialistic bent with this administration, and people reject that.
Senator, thanks so much for coming in.
Good
I really
to be with
appreciate it.
You bet.
And look for more on this in the Oklahoman and on newsok.com.